Hi there. We're going to be talking about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and that is parental shame related to deaf and hard of hearing children. Um, Specifically, I'm entitling this presentation Parental Shame, Social Reactions and the Acceptance of Deafness, and Social Psychological Perspective on Parent Experiences. I've come into this project with a research question that essentially just wants to look at how other people's reactions and parents' perceived stigma of a hearing loss impacts their ability to accept their child's diagnosis and whether or not that diagnosis impacts the parents' mental health and the attitudes they have towards their child and their child's deafness. I looked at 6 research studies for this project, and I will kind of go through them one by one. The first study I looked at was one entitled Stigma in Mothers of Deaf Children, which was written by Ibrahimi et al. In 2015. And their research question was, do mothers of deaf children experience high levels of stigma? This study included 90 mothers from Iran, ranging in age from 18 to 39. They had a deaf child, and that deaf child had to have been diagnosed with a hearing loss at least 6 months prior to the start of this study. Uh, Out of those 90 children, 22 of those children used cochlear implants, and 68 of those children used hearing aids. This was a cross-sectional study that it was a 2-part questionnaire. One part was looking at the demographics, the age of the mother, the education, type of occupation, whether she worked in and out of the home. They explored things like if there was a family history of deafness, things like that, and the mother's perceived level of shame. The second questionnaire was a perceived stigma for mothers, which was a self-reported 48-question questionnaire where the mothers answered questions using a Likert scale on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being never, 5 being always, about their level of perceived stigma that they were receiving related to their deaf child. The questionnaire for the mothers really assessed the mother's belief on how other people might have had a disability, looked at a stereotype of their child. So thinking things like, does my child always need to be protected? Or others think that having a child is a sign of divine punishment. The other part of this questionnaire was looking at the mother's own belief of her stereotype. So does she think her child needs protection, or does she think that her child is a result of divine punishment? And then looking up the overall general stigma. So these are behaviors based on social isolation and discrimination. Things like people stare at us. I'm embarrassed about having this child. Interestingly, the findings in the stigma score, the mean with a standard deviation was 96.48 plus or minus 27.72. So the standard deviation was actually quite large, which shows us that the experience of these mothers really did vary. And stigma really could be influenced by social and contextual factors, things like family history, if there's other children, um, rather than just being experienced equally across all mothers, like a one size fits all. What they did find, though, was that mothers who had more education did seem to experience less shame. But what I found really interesting in this study is that children who had cochlear implants, or parents who had children who had cochlear implants, they seem to have better scores in all areas of the stigma study aspect of the study compared to children with hearing aids. Which is interesting because, again, cochlear implants are often seen as a fix. You know, the kid is now normal. Hearing aids are more visible technology, so there is likely some more judgment and misunderstanding happening there. So the different devices potentially also do lead to different social reactions, leading to different stigma levels. And so again, like the societal perception of deafness differs depending on how treatable that deafness is, which obviously would impact parental experiences. There is a stigma in mothers who have deaf children. This is shown in the study. Mothers are vulnerable to psychological issues such as grief and shame and overwhelm. And it's really important to remember that stigma is a socially constructed term and concept. And it's not just the child's deafness that is causing the stigma, it is how people react to that. And that is what is shaping parental experiences. The second study I looked at was exploring the information shared on social media with parents of deaf and hard of hearing children. This was written by Orfari Sanzo and Potiger in 2025. Fun fact, I was actually a part of the social media group that this study took place in. So the results were published to us in that group a little bit before it went, or sorry, very shortly after it went to press. So it's kind of neat to see as I was observing this myself what the study ended up looking like. So the meat and potatoes of what I'm going to call her Sanzo because that's what I kind of know her as, Kim Sanzo. She really wanted to look at what kind of information parents are looking for on social media. So, what are they seeking? What are they receiving? And then, how is that information conveyed? Is it being given to parents in a really negative light, in a positive light? So this is an interesting study in that it did happen in a Facebook group. Um, and it was the group is aimed more at American participants. A lot of it is very American based. However, there's participants in this group from across the world. There's over 5,000 people in the group that consists of parents, family members of deaf and hard of hearing children, professionals like teachers, doctors, audiologists, and deaf and hard of hearing individuals. So there were 104 posts made over a 1 month period in January of 2023 that were taken and analyzed. So if a participant's quote from the it might be a post like about a question or what have you, if that was taken and then there was something in there that was coded to found a particular theme, the researchers did contact that particular individual to see if their quote was taken in the correct context and if what they felt was appropriate. And so there were 61 requests with families and only 22 actually were answered. So this was a qualitative textual analysis. So again, they were taking posts from Facebook that were designed. This particular group is designed for parents of deaf and hard of hearing children, and it's created by a hard of hearing individual. They took the data for a month and then analyzed it over a period of 4 months, and then subsequently split it up. So they found, or they coded it, sorry, and then from that coding, they found themes. So they found six pretty explicit themes within the data. And then from that, they had some subsets of information. So the big pieces are seeking information, sharing an anecdote, requesting support, sharing information, answering a question, and showing support. So really, what was really interesting from all of this, though, is that parents were really seeking information that was often inaccurately provided or not provided at all by medical professionals, which suggests bias and stereotypes coming from the professionals, which then can influence how parents are really feeling. So questions were often asked, sorry, back up there. So as I just said, the questions were asked of things that should have been addressed by the medical team. So this shows us that parents are going to social media. Social media is being used as a way for parents to increase their health literacy. It's being used as the place for parents to have an outlet, ask questions, and just share positive and negative things that are happening, and that it provides this place of sameness and support. I think this really suggests that parent acceptance is not shaped only by their family and friends, but also by the broader social environments, including things like online communities and social media. So within this social media group and these posts that were looked at in the interactions, there were only 5 negative responses out of hundreds of posts and comments. So this was a good group. Research study number 3 is entitled Parenting Deaf Children, Exploring Relationships Between Resolution of Diagnosis, Parenting Styles and Morale, and Perceived Child Vulnerability. So this was done by Celia Tell in 2023. Their research question really looked at how does a parent emotionally adjust to their child's diagnosis, and how they do that will impact how they parent their attitude and the perception of the child. And then they had 2 kind of research hypotheses that they used throughout this study. This study was for 84 Australian parents. They had to have at least one deaf child, ages 5 to 12 years old. They were recruited via survey links by the Sydney Cochlear Implant Center. And then they had a subsample of 42 parents within this group as well that had a deaf child and a hearing sibling. So the parents that had a deaf child and a hearing sibling, they did complete the questionnaires twice. They did exclude, though, 10 parents from this subset of 42. So now we're only dealing with 32 parents because either the parents were deaf or hard of hearing themselves, or they had a sibling that was deaf. So this was an online survey entirely um, online. And what was interesting is they had 146 people start the survey, but less than 80 kind of finished it. So it was an online survey. It did validated questionnaires. They looked at things like the parent experience using the parenting morale index. They did looking at parenting style, perceived vulnerability of the child. And then they did an online narrative interview, which had the parents recall their feelings and the experience when they were given the diagnosis. So this is generally a semi-structured interview that's done in person, but it was adapted as an online questionnaire for this particular study. So all participants completed the demographic, the parenting moral index, and the reaction to the diagnosis interview. And then if they did have another child in that age range, then they completed the child vulnerability scale and the parenting styles dimension questionnaire twice. They did it where they were asked to do both of those questionnaires related to their youngest child and then their oldest child to try to keep the data from being skewed where the parents might have focused first on the deaf child and then on the hearing. It depended on who was the younger child. What they did find from this study is that parents who had the resolved diagnosis, where they accepted, like, my child is deaf, nothing I can really do about it, they had higher morale. They showed much more positive parenting. They had a healthier parent-child relationship, and they didn't view their child as vulnerable as parents who were not necessarily resolved to the diagnosis. They found that the parents who really didn't accept their child's diagnosis, they struggled really emotionally. They felt a lot of grief and uncertainty and denial. And that's not to say that the parents who had resolved diagnosis didn't feel the struggle and didn't feel the grief, but they just didn't feel it at the level of parents who had not accepted that diagnosis, which again goes to show that acceptance really plays a key role in the shaping of parental well-being and the perceptions that they have of their child. And acceptance isn't only an emotional process, it's a psychological one that really shapes how parents respond to their child. Study number 4 was hearing parents' appraisals of parenting a deaf or hard of hearing child. It's an application of positive psychology framework. And this was by Zarkowski and Bryce. And I have to say, this is one of my most interesting studies that I read looking at it from the social psychology perspective. And they asked, how do hearing parents appraise and make meaning of their experiences raising a deaf and hard of hearing child within a positive psychological framework? So if you think back to the previous study, those questions really focused on kind of a deficit perspective. How does having a deaf child impact the parent in a negative light? Where these guys were really looking at how parents interpret and make sense of raising a deaf child. And rather than just focusing on the challenges, they were asking parents to find positive meaning and growth and coping strategies from their experiences. So this was a rather small study. Participants were recruited from deaf and hard of hearing schools in Eastern USA. There were 11 parents, 8 of them were female, 3 of them were male. The males were married to the female, so we were looking at a total of 8 children that were being examined in here, eight experiences. The children used a variety of devices. Some had cochlear implants, some had hearing aids, some didn't wear anything. But really interesting is the majority of the children were bilingual. So the parents reported that their child's communication method, whether that was sign language or spoken English, depended on the partner that they were communicating with. The research design, this was a qualitative, purposeful sampling design. So they really handpicked a specific group, which was parents of deaf and hard of hearing children. They really had a strong positive psychology focus. They emphasized on the strengths, the resilience, and overcoming challenges of having a deaf child. And it was phenomenological. They really wanted to look at shared experiences and they wanted to see subjective versus true reality. And then they coded that to find themes. And really interesting was that the 9 themes that were found rather had a pretty positive vibe to them. They talked about getting to know the child, appreciating the everyday positives, increasing involvement with their child, relishing in the highs, like so when their child maybe spoke or signed a word, taking things for granted, letting go, just saying, I accept what this diagnosis is, and I'm just gonna only focus on the things I can actually change, learning, advocating, and experiencing personal growth. So the findings really showed that parents can find positive meaning. They can experience challenges, but also they can experience positives. And meaning making really helped parents with coping. That positive psychology framework was really, really useful. And some parents, they view the experience of having a deaf child as meaningful and enriching. It's not just this difficult experience that researchers sometimes believe it's going to be. They see that their kids were resilient and they valued the relationship that they have with their children. Often this was connected with their ability to meaningfully communicate with their child. And I would just say, like, just like raising a hearing child, parents have positive and negative aspects of their life all the time. So yes, there is stress and uncertainty, but there's also a lot of positive experiences that happen. So when parents can get away from the why me, the study really showed if they can find a purpose, they cope so much better. They're so much more confident as a parent. And those experiences obviously would impact a child's development. So the positive psychology lens really helps the parents to see that and get rid of that deficit perspective. It changes that thinking of what's wrong with my kid to how can I adapt and help them grow. The fifth study I looked at was parenting stress among parents of deaf and hard of hearing children, associations with language delays and behavior problems. Essentially, this question was asking, does hearing status lead to language delays, which lead to behavior problems, which lead to parenting issues? So the participants were recruited from the Childhood Development After Cochlear Implant program. This is a longitudinal study, but they took a smaller group out of this group for this particular part of the study. Um, all of the parents in this group were agreeing to pursue only spoken language. There was 188 deaf children, and they did exclude 7 parents from this group because of their hearing status. If they were deaf or hard of hearing, they were not actually included. And then they also recruited parents of hearing children, and there was 97 hearing children. And what this study was doing was comparing um, that the experience of parents who have deaf children and parents who have hearing children, and also just looking at children in general, if they have language delays, if that led to behavior problems and what have you. So this was a quantitative cross-sectional study. Parents did some questionnaires. There was a parenting stress questionnaire, and then there was a context-specific stress type of questionnaire, and then parent-reported behavior problems, which was a part of a checklist. For the children, they did observe the children. They took a 20-minute video where there was 10 minutes of doing some free play, 5 minutes of problem solving, and 5 minutes of an art gallery task where the children were actually working with their parents. And then an observer recorded and later went back and coded it using the mother-child structured interaction qualitative rating scale. So parents were asked to act as you normally do, and then it was scored. And then each child had a standardized assessment related to their verbal comprehension and expressive language in oral language. So again, they were comparing deaf and hearing groups on their parenting stress, the behavior problems, language delays, and they controlled for education and income levels. What they found was that parents of deaf children had more context-specific parenting stress. So these are things like communication challenges, navigating hearing devices and those needs, just very deaf-specific challenges. Deaf children often had more behavioral problems and language delays than hearing children, and those behavior problems were often related to non-compliance and inattention. It seems that the language delays did appear to contribute to behavioral problems, which increased parental stress. So kids that had better language scores had less behavioral problems, and parents had less stress. I wonder why. And the hearing loss doesn't necessarily directly cause the stress to the parents, but rather the language delays and the behavior problems are what's causing that stress. Parents of deaf and hard of hearing children, this is showing that they do face a unique and high level of stress, but it's more related to the hearing and the deafness specific events rather than just parenting a deaf child. Research study number 6 is a phenomenological study of parenting stress among Korean mothers of deaf children. This was by Park and Yoon. And they were looking specifically at what causes parent stress, how do the mothers cope with the stress, and what do they need to cope with the stress. So this was involving 5 Korean mothers, and they had oral deaf children who were now teenagers. They had to have been in a mainstream school environment for middle or high school. They out of these participants, 3 were cochlear implant users and 2 were hearing aid users. So this was again a phenomenological design, and it was a qualitative research design. They used snowball sampling and purposeful sampling because they really wanted a specific group of parents. So this was 2 in-depth, semi-structured interviews that lasted about 2 hours each. And then they analyzed because they wanted to explore the lived experience of Korean mothers raising deaf children and and understand how they can interpret and experience parental stress. Within this, the findings were that there were 7 categories, which broke down into about 21 different concepts. Things like frustrations with parenting their child, all related to things like communication barriers, again, misunderstandings, complexities raising the deaf children, struggling in the mainstream and special education, just navigating which is best. Is it the mainstream? Is it the special school? And in Korea, there is a lot of stigma related to deaf children going to deaf schools. Alienation in a mainstream school, how their child was treated when they were in a mainstream classroom, being left out by their families. Families just didn't seem to understand the needs that the child, and then the moms felt really isolated. Making sacrifices for the child. The moms talked a lot about giving up their time, giving up who they are to help make sure this child is successful. They talked about value changes, just changes in their own personal priorities and perspectives. And then the services that the families needed to help meet their needs. And these were things like community inclusion, professional supports. So it really was multifaceted and culturally shaped stress that this study undid. So looking back at all 6 of our studies, there was some really huge key findings that I found. Parental experiences are often shaped by social reactions, stigma, and support. So the negative social reactions and stigma obviously increase parental shame, stress, and uncertainty, which decreases the ability for the parent to accept their child's diagnosis. When they had positive support and positive access to information, we found that parents had a much more increased likelihood of accepting their child's diagnosis, and the parental confidence and their ability to cope with what was happening was much stronger, which again shows parental well-being is so tied into positive support and information. And we know when our parents are well, they can parent well, which really helps children develop well as well. Acceptance of the child's diagnosis often means better well-being and better and more positive view of their children, which we know leads to better child development. Lack of acceptance results in more stress, higher perceived stigma and vulnerability. And when parents are able to reframe their child's diagnosis and get and feel support, they are more likely to be psychologically well, which is going to trickle down to the child. So essentially, parents need holistic, family-centered support services. They need unbiased health information and a healthcare team that provides support and information. These are my references for what I read, and I encourage you to take a look at them. And we'll see you in a little bit to talk about our next topic, to kind of wrap this all up a little bit more.